Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In this video, I will explain you what is RBAC and the RBAC architecture. Using RBAC, you can authenticate your user and then you can authorize as well. Once you authorize, you can access your Kubernetes resources like pod deployment inside your Kubernetes cluster. There are two types of authorization. One is a role-based authorization and second one is ClusterROLE based authorization. So later in the video, I will also give a demo on how to authenticate and how to authorize. First, we need to understand why we need RBAC. So here I would like to give one scenario here. I have a team called DevOps team. That DevOps team have a user called John. John needs to access the Kubernetes cluster where there are a lot of resources like pods, deployment, secrets, ingress, etc. So in order John to access these resources, first he need access to the Kubernetes cluster. By default, John will not have access to the Kubernetes cluster. He has to get authenticate. Once the authenticate is successful, he can go and access the resources, but again resources are not come by default. So in order for John to access these resources, he needs to do authorize first. So once the authorization is successful, he can go and access the resources available in the Kubernetes cluster. The system administrator create a user called John. Once John get his access, he will try to execute the kubectl command inside your Kubernetes cluster. So what John will see, the authentication required. So one thing I would like to clarify here, the operating system user is completely different when compared to Kubernetes user. In Kubernetes, there is no such thing called Kubernetes user. The authentication always happens either through a certificate or through a token. Here we are going to use the certificate method. So John has to perform few other activities to get his access. John has to work with the Kubernetes administrator to create a key and the certificate signing request file. So he will go and create a key file and then he will create a CSR file. CSR is nothing but the certificate signing request file which has to authorized by someone in the Kubernetes cluster. That authorized person here is going to be a ca.crt, ca.key. These two files are nothing but it's a public profile file which will help you to create a trust for any user who need access. Once that trust is get created, the john.crt, the certificate file will be created. So now John has two files, john.key and certificate file. Still, John, when he execute the kubectl command, he will get the authentication issue. He needs one more file called john.config. This config file has to be get created. That file will look like this. This is one of the other user who has access to this Kubernetes cluster. Once we create this config file for John, John will be good enough to execute the kubectl command. So now John successfully authenticated inside the Kubernetes cluster, but still John cannot access the resources inside the Kubernetes cluster. When he try to access any of the resources like pods or deployment or anything like replica set, etc., you'll be getting the authorization error like this. So in order to access the resources, John has to get authorized. So authorization can be done by a couple of ways. One is through role and role binding, but role and role binding can be done at the namespace level. Okay. So in order to do authorization at the role base, there should be some rules which you need to given at the role creation. So as I mentioned before, John belongs to DevOps team. So at the same time, I don't want John to access all the resources, and also John does, since he's new, we don't really want John to go and do certain activities like networking or the secret management, etc. Only we wanted to give John for the couple of resources. So here we are saying that John can perform create and delete for the resources pod and deploy. So we earlier we have seen multiple resources. Now we are restricting John to access only the couple of resources like pod and deploy, and that too he can perform only create and delete. So the pods and deployment fall under the API group called apps. For example, ingress and ingress will fall under the networking. Likewise, there are multiple resources will have its own API group. And you right now, John belongs to DevOps group, and then there are some set of rules we define. But we need to bind John, the user John, with the role what we have created. That is called the role binding. Okay, now as I mentioned before, there is another way you can do the authorization, which is your cluster role and binding. In the first one, the role and role binding, you can do the authorization at the namespace level. If you wanted to maintain the authorization at the cluster level, then you can go with cluster role and binding. Okay, for this demo, I'm going to use this block. So going under security, click the RBAC. So here I'm going to follow all the steps that are given in this block. Okay, so let me go back to my terminal. The terminal with the root user, that is a system admin, where I will be performing some Linux admin commands, and here I will be executing all my Kubernetes admin commands. Okay, let me go back to my document. First, I'm going to create a user, John. I set the password. Okay, so now I completed the step 1 under authentication. Now I'm going to go back to my Kubernetes admin, going to perform under Kubernetes admin. Okay, so let me quickly execute. So under this directory, if you see here, I don't have anything. This command is going to create the key file. So now I have created the certificate signing key. As I mentioned before, this file should be authorized by the Kubernetes cluster using the file ca.crt and ca.key. Once trust is get created, it will generate the certificate file. So if you see here, the certificate file john.crt get created. Okay, now I'm going back to the step 3 in the document. kubectl config view. If you see, I'll be using this information in my next command. Okay, going back to clear. I just wanted to tell how did I get this information. You simply have to give kubectl config view, get that value from here, and you have to pass it here. So this CACRT and everything file comes as part of your Kubernetes cluster installation. So what we are doing now, we are setting the credential for the user John to get go to access the kubectl get parts. That is what we are trying to do here. Okay, so now I'm going to following the step 4. Okay, I'm just following the step 4 in the block. You might have multiple contexts. To change the context to the John, that's what we are doing. We are switching to the context, the John. If you see there is a star, that means your John-Kubernetes is the context that you are using in this Unix session. Okay, so all the authentication step is complete. What you can do now, you can simply go and verify whether John can do the kubectl get parts command. Before that, I will give a full permission. Chmod. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm switching the user to John. Okay, cd/m/ okay, so this is what I told you before. Once you are now officially logged into the Kubernetes cluster, all your authentication step is complete, but still you are getting forbidden bit because you are not authorized to access the resource parts. Okay, so we need to do a authorization now. So going back to my document, your authentication is complete, so we are going back to B, which is nothing but your authorization. So let me go and follow this. Okay, sorry, I need to go back to Kubernetes admin. Okay, so clear it. So everything I gave, like what user you need to use in order to execute the command. I really wanted you to understand the concept. Instead of just executing the command blindly, you need to understand why we are executing this command, etc. Okay, if you see here, I told you before there are like rules you need to define. So I'm telling that for this role, I'm creating a role called DevOps. For this role DevOps, I'm telling that I need to execute only these two action for the resource pods that belongs to the API group called apps. Okay, so that is what we just created the role, and then we need to bind that role to the user John. If you see here, I'm using the user John. When you go and execute, now John should be able to access your pod by, let me go back, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back as John now. So I'm going to execute this command pwd cd/emp/RBAC. The reason why I'm going every time here, because this kubeconfig file located here, otherwise I need to change it accordingly. Okay, you see here, previously I was getting the forbidden error, now I'm not getting. So this no resource found is not an error because I don't have any pods or anything running here. That's why, but this is expected. So I can successfully see what pods are running under the namespace called DevOps. Okay, so every time I cannot go and create the same process for multiple user. So once that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create this. If you see my previous command, I use John. Instead of that, I'm going to create a group. So basically what I'm going to do, delete. The reason, okay, let me go back to my Kubernetes admin. So always see that whenever you see Jenkins, that means I'm executing as Kubernetes admin. So I deleted now, and I'm going to recreate. Previously, everything was under the user. Okay, now okay, if we go and execute this command, earlier I didn't execute that command. I was to show that earlier, oh, sorry, not this one. If you see here, earlier the kind was user, and you can see user as John, but if you see the kind is group. So what does it mean? Okay, so it's all goes at the hierarchical level. Next time any user who has access to namespace, you will automatically have access to this namespace. That means you need not to execute the step B1 to 3. I logged in as John now, so now I'm going to do kubectl. Let me copy this command. You might wonder like why I'm not giving a, okay, I need to go back to RBAC. Okay, you might wonder why am I giving every time this one, because your dot cube folder, whenever you execute kubectl folder, that kubectl folder will expect some config file under your home directory, which this home directory does not, that particular config file does not located under the cube directory. So in order for you to do, you have to follow this. The section D actually represent that. So what I'm going to do, basically I'm going to, I doesn't want any user passing this unnecessary parameter in the regular kubectl command. So let me follow this under the section D. Okay, if you go and execute, you need not to give this extra parameter. You simply can give kubectl get parts. Okay, so that is how in the user, whoever the new user get created, so the configuration file, the certificate file, everything will be moved under this directory. So when they execute, they can just execute the normal commands like this. Okay, so I told that next time when the new user James, I wanted to show how James will automatically get access without executing the step under the B. That's what I'm going to show you now. Just for the interest of time, I'm going to pause this video for a moment. I will execute the same whatever the user John I have created. I'm going to create the same thing for the James. Okay, I have added the user James. I'm going to follow the authentication for James. Okay, so I've done everything for the James as well. If you see here, James, let me give a full permission for all the file. Okay, so I just only did the authentication for James. Now sudo, I'm going back to login as James, clear. So but I did not do anything for the role binding for James. Okay, I need to go to the temp directory. Okay, see, it's working good. If you wanted to make James also to remove this one, you need to follow what is there in the document, the D. You need to follow this step for James. Okay, I just gave that in the document. You can follow this. Okay, so now James and John got access to the Kubernetes cluster, and they can access to the pod through the role based and role binding. So if I wanted to do the same stuff for the cluster one, as I said before, the cluster based is actually not at the namespace level. So what I'm going to do to show how the cluster role and cluster role binding works, I'm going to delete the role what was created as part of the role binding. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. So do a exit. So now I'm in, now I logged in as a system administrator. So going back to the document, I'm going to delete the role binding for the DevOps. I deleted that. I'm also deleting the role DevOps. So I just wanted to show how the cluster role works. If you go back to login as James, it will not work. Sudo John or James, whatever it is, right? If you go and use, it will not work. kubectl get pods. It will start throwing an error forbidden. Okay, that's expected. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to show the cluster role. Okay, that's what my intent. So I'm going to create a role, cluster role for the verb. Okay, we see here I'm creating a cluster role called DevOps for the web get list for the resource parts. Okay, I created the role, cluster role. Now I'm going to do a cluster role binding for the user John. Okay, so now I created the user John and assigned that user binded to the role called cluster role called DevOps. Okay, now I going back to sudo su-john kubectl get pod. See, so same thing, but this will work not only for the DevOps namespace, any namespace whatever I gave across the cluster, it should work. It's not just specific to namespace. So even if you go and create a different namespace, still you can access that. Okay, that is all about this document. If you wanted I also mentioned some other commands like how to, in case if you mistakenly create some user, if you wanted to unset, if you wanted to do certain cleanup, that is also given here. I hope you like this video. If you like this video, please like it and subscribe it. Thank you.